what I'm going to do is to talk about indicating in space and time. And let me start out with my theme. And this is a theme that I will grind into you by the time we're done here. To communicate means to make common. So then the real question is, make common in what way? Well, there is a notion of common that is very well developed in philosophy and computer science and elsewhere. And I'm going to make terrific use of this notion of common ground here. Then the question is, who's common ground and how do you establish it? So there's a real problem of how you get something to be in, how you know something is common ground. So how do Peter and I know that something is common ground between us, and how do I establish that? So there's a history of the study of common ground, and for me it started with David Lewis. David Lewis is my real inspiration for all of the stuff that I've ever done on common ground. He used the term common knowledge, but he used it in a very general way. It didn't have to be knowledge. It could be a belief. It could be various other things. Stephen Schiffer then came along very soon after and screwed up the whole concept. I'm going to do this again with some other philosophers, so watch out here. And called it mutual knowledge and mutual beliefs. And he didn't use the same definition as David Lewis. And actually, it's a crucial distinction here, as I'll come back to. John Ullman, who got the Nobel Prize a few years ago, started with a notion of common knowledge himself. A very technical definition that was used in economics. John McCarthy, who is one of the founders of AI, had a notion of joint knowledge, which as far as I can see is the equivalent of, well, I forget whether it's David Lewis's or Stephen Schiffer's views of all this. Grice had a notion of M-intention that he mentions in his early papers, and it's never defined really terribly carefully, but later on the philosopher X, who I'm now blocking on X, pointed out that this is basically just a kind of, it was the notion of common knowledge. It was related to the notion of common knowledge. You'll see here, Bob Stolnicker is a person who explicitly introduced the term common ground. Before him, Karttunen and Peters introduced the notion of the term common ground, but didn't define it. Bob actually did define it fairly carefully. And I myself, with two co-authors, have talked about this stuff. We originally used the word mutual knowledge. I now really seriously regret, because what it did was to tie it to Schiffer's notion as opposed to Lewis's notion. And then we later generalized this to common ground. So the whole notion, though, what is common ground? Basically, you don't want to restrict your notion to beliefs, to knowledge alone, or beliefs alone. And so the way Bob talks about it, really, it's it's the sum of two people's, let's say, A and B's, if you're talking about A and B. There are mutual knowledge, mutual belief, mutual suppositions, various other sorts of things. You can include lots of stuff in that, and I'm going to include lots of stuff in it, as long as it is characterizable in a certain way. So what is common ground? The simple point is, of course, it's information that is shared by specific individuals. That is, you can't talk about common ground in general. You have to talk about Peter's and my common ground. Or pick your two individuals. It's the common ground that belongs to two individuals, or 10 individuals, or a community. And actually, the original version by David Lewis, he talks about a community of individuals. I'm going to stick mostly with a pair of individuals simply because I'm usually talking about two people talking. And that's what we're going to be interested in. So what is A and B's common ground? So if we think of Peter and me, what is our common ground? And here I'm going to go to my own view. Well, I'm going to develop my view, which is just simply based on David Lewis. who again, as I say, is one of my heroes in the field. We have, in this original paper, this is Kathy Marshall and I, said, look, common knowledge isn't just general. There are really two bases, two types of bases for common ground. One of them is our personal common ground. So Peter and I have lots of history together. There are things that we know or believe that we share that we established personally. That is, we saw the same people, we met the same people at the same time, all kinds of stuff of that sort. That is, it comes from our joint communications, but also our joint perceptual experiences. But there's also communal common ground. That is, there are things that once I meet somebody, and once I know they're an American, I say, they know how big our Congress is. They know where the state of Iowa is. I mean, there are all sorts of things that you immediately know if you meet somebody and establish that the two of you are members of the same cultural community. That's what a culture is. A culture is a mass of mutual, joint, common beliefs and common information, put it in a strong way. Yeah. So let me start with communal common ground. What is it and how do you get to it? Well, the thing is, everyone belongs to a lot of different communities. For example, we automatically, by being born, belong to a gender, an age cohort, typically an ethnicity because you're born certain ethnic groups, but you acquire various categories by where you were, where you became a citizen, the language that you learned, the dialect of that language, the residence, the religion, all sorts of things that these are arbitrary large categories here, but these are the small kinds of things that you do. Chosen categories, I choose where to go. University graduates, I choose a profession, employment. This isn't born. I have to choose these things, but once I've done this, then these define a bunch of communities that I belong to. So this is sort of rough categorization here. What's not rough is the fact that we keep track of these things. So I meet someone and I say, that's a man. And automatically, if I know that the two of us decide, boy, the two of you are men, boy, do we now know, there are a bunch of things that we can now take for granted as common ground. Certainly true if you meet somebody else who's a Brit, I meet somebody else who's another Midwestern American. All of these have that property. You meet someone and immediately, the really interesting cases are things like an ophthalmologist meets another ophthalmologist, never met this person before. Immediately they can take for granted everything that ophthalmologists are expected to know. And it's a huge piece of lots of information. And we do this as a matter of course all the time. And this is why we have categories. We have these person categories. So Londoners, we call someone a Londoner. That immediately says what is their expertise about locations. We say I meet someone, they're a lawyer. I immediately have a set of things that I take for granted that they know, and so on. But this is the way we categorize people. We don't categorize people as, no, I won't go into this. But common ground for, let's say, two lawyers. So you take two American lawyers, what do they know? They know an enormous amount. And let's say they've never met each other, they meet each other, they now have lots of knowledge about what laws are like, what penal codes in specific are like, certain kinds of regulations that are in the states or the state that they happen to be in. They will know and take for granted they know people. So who is Learned Hand? How many people in this room know who Learned Hand is? There's one. So, but every lawyer, an American lawyer, will all know who Learned Hand was, and every lawyer will take for granted that every other lawyer does too. They know appearances, so what courtrooms look like, what jury boxes look like, what a legal brief would look like. You meet someone who isn't a lawyer, they aren't necessarily going to know these things. Practices, petitions, filings, court etiquette, lexicon. This is what I'm going to focus on here. Recusal, tort, voir dire. none of the rest of us in America know what these terms are, but if you're a lawyer, by God, you know them. Actually, that's not quite true. People outside who are not lawyers will know some of these terms, but every lawyer will take for granted a communal lexicon. That's the next topic here. That is, so to use a word with somebody is to presuppose that they have the word in one of these communal lexicons that belongs to one of these communities that we all happen to share. And so I can't walk up to somebody and just say, an onderontia. Let's do that one. How about that? So you have to be pretty good. You have to know your Dutch pretty well to know what an onderontia is. I have to assume that this guy is a Dutch speaker and that person believes that I actually am a Dutch speaker, and we can now use the same term. So there is this presupposition here that every word that you use has to be shared. That is, it has to be a lexical entry in one of our, so if Peter and I are talking, they have to be in one of our communal lexicons. Is onderontia something that you would know? No. There we go. Good. Because I didn't think the two of us knew that we were both, knew some Dutch. I have to be careful here. So here's a case of the lawyer here. For this tort, will you take part in the voir dire or will you recuse yourself? Now, if you just said this to the average American, they aren't going to have the remotest idea what this is about. But lawyers would be able to take all of this stuff. What we underestimate is the fact that we have this enormous, well, every community that we belong to has a specialized set of words that belongs to that community and that community alone. For example, these are things that a physicist would know. It's often taken for granted that because you're an English speaker, you just know this gigantic vocabulary. Well, you do. That's probably the biggest communal lexicon I have. But it's certainly not the only one, and there are these subsets. And the thing is, they are structured in a nice way. So let me start with why is it makes a difference. So here's a physicist to a Hollywood actor. I study charms, this physicist says to this Hollywood actor. And the Hollywood actor says, well, I do too, but of course they don't mean the same thing. So they're one of 6 flavors of quark as opposed to that. Physicist says to Hillary Clinton, I study mesons, and she says, I have no idea what this guy is talking about. Maybe she would know, well, that's something in physics, and maybe it is even in subatomic physics, but she has no idea otherwise what it is. It's just a term. So biologist to a lawyer, I study rare fruits. Now, a fruit for a biologist is a very specific sort of thing. It's a seed-bearing structure of a plant. Now, for the rest of us, fruit is, in the general vocabulary, it's sweet and fleshy, and this to be eaten as food. Now, every biologist is going to know that when they use the word fruit, it has this ambiguity. Is it the general word or is it the biologist-specific word? And in fact, you have to make clear what it is that you're doing. And that will always be true for those sorts of cases. Brit to an American says, I never wear vests. Now, an American thinks, God, this means he doesn't wear what the Brits would call a waistcoat, a waistcoat. For me, this is nonsense here. But he meant what an American would mean by undershirt. So this, we're going to miscommunicate unless we recognize that we have different interpretations of the word vest. So paying attention to the lexicons that you share is an essential part of all of the communication that we do. And the more specialized the communication is, the more you have to worry about this. But these are nested. And I'm just going to give a nesting of terms that are used to names for places. So this is a name for a place. Every American, North American is going to, Canadian, they're all going to know Niagara Falls. Most Americans are going to know Rockefeller Center. That's because it's a famous place of television programs and so on. You can generally, but if you're a Westerner, you know about Hoover Dam. Do you know this if you're a New Yorker? Probably not. If you're a Californian, you're going to know Big Bear Lake. If you're not a Californian, you're not necessarily like. Sutter's Mill is known to Northern Californians. San Franciscans are, notice, these are all single term identifications of people categories. And we have all these different vocabulary words that we recognize are going to be known to these different people. So San Franciscans are going to know Crissy Field. You aren't going to know it, and most Chicagoans aren't going to know, and so on. Residents of Nob Hill are going to know the entrance to the Pacific Union Club. Other people aren't. These are all cross categories too. So if you're a San Francisco physician, you're going to know where the UCSF ER is, and you're going to know it by that term. If you're a lawyer, you're not necessarily, but you're going to know where Bolt Library is. These guys are not going to necessarily, even though these are cross-categorized by San Franciscans. That is, again, think of the problem that we constantly are trying to solve, which is what are these communities that we belong to, and how do they intersect in their various ways? Every communal lexicon presupposes an expertise of a certain kind. So to know what Spanner, Nickel, Nicked, and dustbin are, these are British terms. They are non-American terms. Americans just don't know this. So it means that you have an expertise in British English. But this says that you have an expertise in physics. And by that I mean, it isn't just that you know that a meson is a subatomic particle. You know what subatomic particle it is and how it's related to all the other ones. And same thing with charm. These things are just presuppose an expertise in US law. You don't really know what a recusal is or a tort is unless you have an expertise in that. These presuppose an expertise in San Francisco places. And again, every one of these communal lexicons has that sort of character to it. So we're constantly negotiating this stuff. And I'm going to do this with one of my favorite colleagues, but I'm going to pretend that I don't know her. And we're at a party in Palo Alto, and I say, "Hi, I'm Herb." And she says, "Oh, hi, I'm Layla. I'm in psychology at Stanford, and you?" She says, "Well, you must have known Cliff Nass. I was a student of his. I work in human-computer interaction." "Ah, so you must know Stu Card." And she says, "Oh, yes, I worked for him one summer." So what have we done here? So Jan Svenevig has done these kind of get acquainted conversations. They have this character. What we have done is establish a huge number of these communities that we jointly belong to. So these are inferable. For me, she's looking at me and she says, "Ah, man, middle-aged, yuck." European American appearance and accent, Western American English from the accent, but I tell her. And this is what we established very quick, that I'm a Stanford professor and a psychologist. Now, I can see she is a woman in her 20s. She's Asian American, and I can get from appearance and accent. She speaks Western American English. She's a Stanford student in communications, and that's because she told me this. And she belongs to the HCI community. And notice then, all of a sudden, I can draw all kinds of conclusions. Ah, you must know Stu Card. If she's an HCI, she's going to know Stu Card. On and on and on. So we start with these categories, and this allows us to do all kinds of deep judgments about what would be in our communal common ground. Personal common ground is something else again. Here, so I've already given you some examples. That is, people look at each other and they say, or they look at events together. So all of us are looking at this thing right here. So I can say, ooh, this must be expensive. And now we get this from our personal common ground because, in fact, this is visually representable to all of us. So perception is one way. Objects and events that we are jointly perceiving or have. Emotional reactions that we all have and realize that we are all jointly having. We take the stuff that I talked about on Monday, the goals that we are taking for granted in our joint activities. So we're doing something together, and I take for granted that these are the goals that you and I have come to have at the current stage. And then there's all the stuff that we get from communication, the stuff I talked about as depictive, descriptive, and indicative. I mean, everything that we're talking about here is communication. These lead to, and they're intended to establish certain things as common ground. That is the whole point of the work by Bob Stolnicker and all the people who've worked in this sort of area. Okay, I'm going to use as an example of how people establish this personal common ground. This is William and Kate. Now, I hope all of you know who William and Kate are. You don't have to because, of course, you're Swedes. But you have this royalty up here. So these are, this is William. He's the next king of England, we assume. And this is Lupo, a dog. So here is, it is crucial that you get this point right because this is what Stephen Schiffer did not get right. On the beach, here William is thinking, gee, Kate and I are looking at this dog in the same way. Therefore, it must be common ground. Is that true? No. Just because they're looking at it in the same way doesn't mean it's common ground because he has to think about the scene. And the way to do it is to say there's a mirror up here. And so what he's now doing is looking at this scene and saying, in this, and he's saying about the mirror, Kate and I are looking at this scene in the same way. Now notice that the scene includes him and her and the dog and his thoughts and her thoughts. And unless he gets it this way, that this is a reflexive definition of, in this case, beliefs about what they're looking at. So what you have here is common ground is a reflexive belief where the way to think about this is the way I said X here. So the line X is William believes Y. And what he believes, of course, is that he's looking at Lupo. And that X, that is, that, in fact, this, he is, in fact, believing this. This is his belief about himself. So he can say, ooh, I believe that that's Lupo. He can say, I believe that that's Lupo, but he can also say, I believe that it's Lupo. And so he can do all this reflexive stuff. And think of X as the analogous to the information that's in a mirror. Now when it's Kate and him, he is doing the following. He's saying, I'm going to add Kate here. And so the X here is William and Kate believe Y, and this Y is the same thing here. But the X now has Kate in it as well as him. And so this leads to this reflexive belief, but it's a reflexive belief that the two of them have. I mean, that includes the two of them in this way. So technically, and these are some things that you want to say down here. The requirements really are that when I say in the same way, I really mean in the same way. So he's looking at this dog and saying, I know that that's a Corgi Dachshund mix and that his name is Lupo. But he also thinks that Kate knows that. And when he's looking at the whole thing and that she knows that about this, and so the whole scene that they're looking at has this property. Now, here is the difference between David Lewis and Stephen Schiffer. The reflexive belief is this, that A believes Y and that y is that p and that x. And notice what you can do is to iterate this thing, and you can come up with an infinity of statements here about these beliefs. So if this is reflexive belief, A believes that P, A believes that A believes that P, A believes that A believes that A believes that P. And you can do this iteration to your heart's content. Of course, we don't do this ordinarily. We sort of, if you are forced to think about this, you think maybe 1 or 2 or 3 x's deep here. That's also true of common ground here. But here we've got A believes that P and B believes that P. A believes that B believes that P, and B believes that A believes that P, that should be, and so on. So you can iterate this thing out too. Now, so what the difference here is that is David Lewis's definition, and it's a really simple statement. It's just that it's reflexive in a sense that it refers to itself. Here is Stephen Schiffer's. He's got this infinite definition, and that is the only way that's his definition of what a mutual knowledge, in his case he was doing this with knowledge, is. Now, this has got to be wrong, you would say, just on the face of it, as a representation of what it is that I have in my head. So I'm going to put this kind of sign here, and let me say why I believe this is true. Whoa, somehow, where'd this come from? So these reflexive representations, the one on the left from the previous slide, is finite. I mean, that's a really important property. It's finite. It's conceptually simple, and it's conceptually simple in the following way. That is, so Peter and I have a certain kind of common ground, and now we add you, and we've got sort of 3 of us now. So in common ground, this grows linearly. This one over here grows exponentially. So if you have 10 people, with the linear common ground, it's just a little bit harder. But with this version over here, it becomes infinite. It grows exponentially. And this version here can accommodate propositions, which is what it was intended to do, namely beliefs, but it will also do perceptual experiences, emotions, know-how, and lots of other things that you want to think of as part of your common ground. Over here, apparently it has these things down here, but this definition over here of Stephen Schiffer's is infinite. It's conceptually, therefore, impossible as a representation of what any one particular person knows. It grows exponentially with the size of the community, and it cannot accommodate these 3 things. It cannot accommodate perceptual appearances. There's no way of getting into his representation, perceptual appearances or emotions or know-how. So I take this to be just kind of a priori evidence that Schiffer's version of the way of doing this, and many, many people cite the infinite regress definition of common ground or mutual belief as the definition. It's just the wrong one. And if anybody had gone back and read David Lewis as they should have, then they would have seen the right one. Okay. Now, so to communicate, so I am now talking to Peter. And to do this at any point, I have to presuppose what is it that's in our current common ground, because I can't say anything without establishing that. And then I have to, for my current utterance, I have to anchor it to that common ground. Now, by anchor, what I'm going to mean here is to index elements of the current social, the local scene here. And I'll give you some evidence of what I mean by this. So this is going to be the bumper sticker that you're going to want to put on your car. There is no communication without anchoring, where, that is, A cannot communicate with B, I cannot communicate with Peter without indexes to him and me as individuals. And you say, well, why to him and me as individuals? Because it's his and my common ground that counts, and it's only his and my common ground that counts. And it isn't common ground in general that counts, or some kind of general knowledge that counts, or context that counts. It is his and my common ground. So we have to establish that. So how do you do this anchoring? Well, we go back to good old William and Kate and Lupo. Lupo, isn't that the name for a wolf? So they think that this little corgi dachshund is a wolf. I mean, that's a pretty strange idea. So if we look at, let's take William here, that's A. He's got a particular view of, I'm going to do really concrete here for the moment because we're going into indicating here, a concrete representation of the scene from his point of view. That is, he sees that the Atlantic is over there and the beach is along there, and this is, I'm moving in that direction. Lobo is over here, and so on. I mean, it's got all this stuff here. What he's doing is identifying the location. He's locating all of this stuff with respect to this frame of reference that he's got for himself. Now, frames of reference, I'm going to be interested, I'm just going to use 3 frames of reference here. One of them is space frame, which is this thing here that I just looked at. You can kind of consider a space frame, what I'm calling a space frame. That is, it has dimensions like northwest, southeast, seaward versus shoreward, up versus down, and there's the origin that will be at his feet. There's also a time frame for any type of activity that he's engaged in. There's a moment in relation to Greenwich Mean Time, let's say. Who knows how he represents this. Today is Tuesday, and this is about 12, and so he's got some kind of representation of that sort. But here's the critical thing. He looks at all the things that he sees here as being elements of this scene, and he has what I've called here an element frame. That is, he sees they have an identity, for example, Lupo, but he's got a location in this frame, and this space frame, and also in the time frame. And also he's got an orientation in this space or time frame. These are what I'm calling indexes here. And this, these are indexes. So here's a person there'll be this is an element frame for a person, here's an element frame for a ball, and I couldn't find a good picture of a person looking at a ball, but here's one of a robot doing the same thing. So they have things represented to them, relative to them, in this sort of way. Now, now I'm going to turn to spatial indexes. That is, how is it that Peter and I managed to anchor things in space? And we do it by means of these spatial indexes, remembering what I just pointed out to you. So I think of it this way. That is, A and B, these two people, presuppose the local scene as common ground. I mean, that's what they do. They have to do this. And that includes the two of them, among other things. Remember, he's looking up at this mirror, which is looking back and saying, here are the two of us in this scene, and along with the dog. Now, the prototype way of indexing things in that scene is pointing. That is, this is the way to do it for each other. Well, actually, it's the way they're going to do it, period. So let's start with pointing like this. So pointing starts really early, and you find it all, and it takes various forms. So here's me pointing at a book. And that's an act of indexing, indicating a thing by locating it. So what I'm doing for my interlocutor, let's suppose I'm looking at my wife over here, I am indicating this thing for her by locating it. And the way now I'm just doing Charles Saunders Peirce, where he would talk about this as an index. That's the index. What it does is to locate something, and I'm calling this the indicatum, for someone else. And I'm doing this for, let's say, for Eve. Eve is the person I'm married to, in case this hasn't occurred to anyone here. So the index has a spatial connection to the indicatum here. The indicatum is always, this is Peirce's point, This is an individual thing. It is not just, you're not indicating a type of thing, you're indicating a thing, a particular indicatum here. You may be referring to other things. So, and the indicatum is to be construed from a particular perspective. Okay, so let's do geometry. So here's the really simple case. So I point with my finger. This is an index, and I'm going to call this a vector index. So this has a vector in the sense that it specifies a direction and often specifies a distance. So David Wilkins would have you, so you raise your hand, and Keita too. It's telling you the direction, but it's also often telling you the how far. And it's saying that the indicatum is at the end of it's at the end of this vector. And here we see it happening. You don't have to just use a finger. You can use guns. You can use golf clubs. You can do anything. But these are all kinds of vector pointing. So these are using props or some kind of intermediate here. Now, there's also something that I'm calling a facet index. That is, here is a facet. So I have a face and a body, and it has a face. It has a back and a shoulder and a side here. And that facet it defines an adjacent zone, the way I'm thinking of it here. And the index is this facet, but what the indicatum is something that, doesn't show up here. The indicatum is here someplace. It will be within this zone. That's what you're doing with facet pointing. And the facet of an object is a front or back or side, and it defines this adjacent zone and so on. So where the indicatum is in that zone. Here are cases of this. So here's a person facing a whole audience. That's the people he is addressing here. She's got her hand up in this way. The sign is simply a facet, and it's facing one direction, and that's how you know what's being pointed at, and so on. Trajectories. When you're driving your bicycle, and I first recognized this when we were boating. So you're out there in your boat, and you're going along. This is a sailboat, and there's another sailboat out there. The other sailboat tells you where they're going to be by orienting their boat in a particular direction. They're telling you the path they're going to take. And this is so I call this a trajectory index. You look at the trajectory right now, and that's telling you where the path that you're interested in. Okay, and we see this all over the place. How people walk. They walk down paths, and they're expected to indicate where they're going by the trajectory of their walking. Then there is something I'm calling the self-index. You could call it an auto-index, where this woman here is really pointing to herself. She's saying, me. So someone says, who knows the answer to this question? She holds her hand up. Now, that's a point to herself. She's using the raised hand to index herself. So the index is right here, and the indicatum is right here. And it's often, these are often the same thing. So the deictic center is located in or at a person, and that's the way you get this. And here are a bunch of examples. Here's a person who's just one, I'm one. And here's a person who says, me, who's me? And so on. So you get these sorts of things. The final one is what I'm calling an exhibited index. A pretty terrible name, but I can't come up with a better one. Here I am holding out something. So this is for you. So this, I'm referring to this, but I'm doing it by exhibiting it to him and showing it, exhibiting it to him. So there's the typical case is a hand. So that's what I have here, where the hand, the exhibited item, the thing that you're really pointing at, is located in the hand or on your head or someplace like this. And what you're doing is indexing that thing. And here's, of course, they're holding up the things that they've just won, these two fabulous tennis players. But you see them all over the place. So in kind of demonstrations, here I'm holding up for the class this chemistry thing here. Here's a guy holding up this fish that he just caught. Here's a woman on the runway. What you're doing is you're exhibiting this clothing for everybody. That's what you're doing here. And the same thing with this woman and her hat. Now, okay, that's the geometry here. That doesn't tell you about the interpretation. The interpretation is, I'm going to go back to my book, is interesting because it's a paperback copy of Hamlet, which you may not be able to see in that picture, but there it is. The point that I can't overstress is the thing that's the indicatum is not necessarily the referent of what it is that I'm trying to refer to here. So it's the physical manifestation that I'm pointing at, but it need not be the referent. And in fact, it almost never is the referent. So I say, now remember, I'm sitting there pointing at this thing and I'm saying, I found this book on your desk. Well, now this is the instance of the book, that particular individual instance. But this book has an awful font. Now, what you really mean is the edition of this book has this awful font. These cost $10 at Borders. Now, these, I'm only pointing at one thing, but you're saying really books of this type, copies of this edition of this book, cost that amount at Borders. I've seen this performed on stage. Well, you haven't seen the book. You've seen Hamlet the play, which is represented in that book, but it isn't the book. This guy is suicidal. Notice I can still point at this book and say this. And now I'm talking about Hamlet the character. And you have to know, I would have to presuppose that you know that the book is about, it's the play Hamlet, and I can then refer to the character. This man is our greatest playwright. Now notice this guy, this man, in one case I'm talking about the character, in the other case I'm talking about the playwright. I can do both of those simply by, through this book. This takes place, of all places, in Denmark. Now, this takes place, well, it's the story that lies behind Hamlet is, so right, say here. This means, so let's just take this character as suicidal. This is a really problematic thing. You have to do a bunch of indexes to get here. So I don't know that this is the right analysis here, but I am pointing at the book. That gets you to the indicatum, but the indicatum gets you to the copy, the physical book, which gets you the printed representation of Hamlet, which gets you to the story of Hamlet, which gets you to Hamlet, the character. Now, that's a string of indexes, but only the first one is the kind of stuff that's done in the physical realm. You have to, part of the way that you get here is to hear me say the word character. And so I know from the reference in the sentence that this has to be a character of some sort. Okay, the challenge then is how to compute chain of indexes and interpretation, and I leave that as a homework assignment for all of you to do. Here's sort of indexical links with book. There are various ways that you can fill out this kind of hierarchy, but it is a hierarchy of a certain kind. Okay, here is an old experiment that I did with a guy named Rupp Schroeder, who is no longer with us, very sadly. And Buttrick, a guy named Buttrick, Sam Buttrick, he would go around on campus and he would give people this picture. I hand you this picture, Peter, and I say one of two things. You know who this man is, don't you? And you would say, you probably don't know who either of these guys is, but that's okay. As opposed to, do you have any idea at all who this man is? Now notice, this man is a reference to one of these two guys. Now, who is it that's being referred to? When I say the first one, you know who this man is, don't you? No one had any worry at all. That is, we'll put it this way, 93% of the people immediately said, it's Reagan. Oh, Reagan, they said. Or, you mean him? Pointing at Reagan. they all knew this is the guy that they should all know. But if you told them, do you have any idea at all who this man is? Now they say, well, it's Stockman. So 47% pointed at this guy over here, or said him. There was a small number who said Reagan, and then a bunch more who said which one. The point is, they're figuring out which one you mean by the presuppositions of the utterance here, along with what we and they took to be common ground for that era. This is the guy they should know. He's a guy named David Stockman, who's a real baddie guy in that era. So I now want to turn, though, to anchoring in the act of communication itself. So I'm going to start here with another president, or two other presidents, actually. I hate to do this, because, of course, I have very strong... That's a guy named Barack Obama. And this is the day of his inauguration, and he is saying goodbye to that guy up there who was happily leaving, happily for us, leaving Washington, D.C. by a helicopter. And so they're waving goodbye, as they should. This is, one of these photographic occasions that you do. So here he's waving goodbye. So that's what you should be looking at. The signal, this is just Saussure. So consists of a display, that is what he produces, what he shows to Bush. And there's the content, what he means by it. And so the display really consists of some sounds, some arm movements, and his posture, his placement, a bunch of other things of that sort. What he means will be one of these things. And in fact, if you say, look at him, he's waving, he's got a particular posture, placement, orientation. And what he means is, I hereby bid you goodbye. That's a little tedious way of saying it, but that's what he's doing, roughly. There's your speech act. So this is, this is really serious, Searle. No, sorry, Austin. I don't want to get these two confused again here. So I now hereby bid you goodbye. There are lots of indexes in that thing, and they have to be specified if he's going to get this right. That is, the index I has to refer to Obama, U to Bush, here Andrews Air Force Base, now particular date and time, that way that he's facing Bush, and hereby, meaning with this wave, he's doing this. Now, how do you get this established? Well, it gets established in the very utterance itself. These indexes, actually, they anchor Obama's display to the local scene, and thereby they get the meaning anchored in the right way. So how do you do this? Well, there are a bunch of self-indexes in here. So the guy who's waving is the guy who's saying goodbye, and that's the waver. The voice, if he said bye, bye, he said in his nice Obama voice, that would have been another self-index. He is located at a particular place. That's telling you where here is. The now is actually the moment of the wave. And that's important because he's waving goodbye now and not 5 minutes earlier, not 5 minutes later, and he's waving at this guy at that moment. And the hereby is done with the wave itself. You have to see the wave as being the way he's doing this. There are vector indexes here, too. He's pointing his arm at Bush. He's not pointing his arm at that guy down there or one of these other guys. It's pointed. And the U is done in part by direction of gaze. It's always done in part by direction of gaze in interactive conversations. There's also the facet index. He is directed this way. And his face in front look that way, and the palm of his hand look this way. So these are all done in the very act of producing the utterance. He gets these things established as common ground, and thereby he gets all the other things for free that go with the fact that he and Bush have this common ground. So what Obama thereby anchors, and he does it with this display, is all this stuff here. And he thereby anchors his act to their current personal common ground and thereby their current communal common ground. If he couldn't do this, none of that would happen, and who knows how the interpretation would have come about. Anchoring in time. Now, this is what I'm going to spend the rest of my talk on. And I think I'm going to do this fairly fast because I've got a lot here. And you should yell if you think it's too much. In any case, I'm going to talk about time as a particular kind of index, temporal indexes. So timing is a feature of all displays. So as here, when I say bye-bye, it's happening at an exact particular time. And I say, Margaret called yesterday, that same thing, wave, the wave goodbye is happening in a particular moment in time. Now, I'm going to call that t of bye-bye. That's the moment in actual physical time that this thing is happening. And we use this for all sorts of things, to refer to the now of this conversation and to bind the now to the I now hereby bid you goodbye. The now in there has to be bound to something, and it's bound to the moment at which this thing is done. And here's the way to think about it. I suppose this is on a Thursday, and I say bye-bye. It marks it temporally indexes that moment, and thereby does all sorts of things. So there's a contrast that I really want to make sure that you get between spatial indexes. I say that's Hamlet pointing at something. That's the spatial index. But there's also, I can indicate a moment in time, which is a temporal index. And the way to think about this is timing is to moments in time as pointing is to moments in space, locations in space. It's just another way of, but there's nothing, so people don't treat timing as somehow an indicator, but it's just as much an indicator as the various other indexes I showed you here. Why do we need it? Well, we need it, first of all, for interpretations of word like yesterday. So I can say to Peter, I said, so I had a nice dinner yesterday. Now, the yesterday you get by the fact that I'm saying it now. And I'm really referring to the day before, the day that includes the moment indicated by t of yesterday. So I'm saying it now, so it gets yesterday by the fact that it's being done today. I hope this is all, I mean, this is really simple-minded kind of semantics. And we need this kind of stuff for all of these temporal adverbs and stuff. So temporal adverbs, tense and aspect. But we need, but there's another idea here, which is there's a pragmatic use of timing. That is, and the simplest case is the starter for this kind of race, ready, set, go. Now, the race starts when I say go. The go actually marks the moment in time that the race starts. I'm using it not semantically, I'm using it pragmatically. And what do I mean by that? Semantic timing is a property of words, like yesterday, this afternoon. Pragmatic timing is a property of display. So a display, is happening at a particular moment in time. These are all particular moments in time, and they're crucial that they are being said at that moment. So the speaker is choosing the word here out of a bunch of possible words, but over here, the speaker is choosing the moment at which to say these things. So that's the difference between a semantic notion of timing and the pragmatic timing. So timing of what? Well, you can time the beginnings of actions, the ends of actions, the suspensions of actions. You can do all sorts of things, and I'm going to come back to this, some of this on tomorrow. Anchoring activities in time. So let's do a really simple one. So I'm going to go back to my, those of you who didn't see Monday's talk will be a little mystified here for the moment, but I had two people putting together a TV stand. And here is the whole joint activity that they engaged in. Each of these stages is a stage, and it occurs at a particular moment in time. And actually, what you'd have to do is to, among other things that you have to coordinate the entry and the exit of this temporally. That is, you have to synchronize them. So they are jointly responsible for the time at which these things start and end, and they have to get them right. The reason is because in any joint activity, time is not my time, it's not your time, it's our time, it's joint time. So here is the kind of idea that I'm starting with for this. To act in a joint activity is to fulfill a joint commitment, to fulfill commitment to others at a particular moment in time. So they're always time limited and time bound in some way. To signal is to make a commitment to others starting at some, so I can say to Peter, I say, welcome. Now, he wasn't welcomed 5 seconds ago, or 10 seconds ago, or 20 seconds ago, but he's now welcomed from now on. I say welcome, and now he's welcome now, and he's welcome the next 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 20 seconds. That is, it's telling you the beginning of a kind of commitment that's being made publicly. And that's going to be the crucial part for all of this stuff that we're going to talk about here. So when do you have to do things? Well, there's I've called this the when needed principle. So in this joint activity of putting together a TV stand, you should be initiating an act, as it says here, when it's needed for the next stage of the activity and when it's possible. And you should use a signal when it's needed to make a commitment for the next stage and when it's possible under the current conditions. Now, so I'm not going to go into this about what is possible. I have to be able to do it, but if my interlocutor, if it's Peter, he has to be able to hear and see and do his part too. There's a bunch of stuff on possibility that I'm not going to discuss here. But this leads to different kinds of timing in ordinary conversations. So I'm going to look at the dialogue part of this building the TV stand. You can have, I'm calling this cross timing. So I do something and then Peter does something. They can be abutted against one another. That's immediate. They can be delayed. They can be overlapping. They can be superposed, as I say here. So that is, what he does can be superposed over mine. Now, the kinds of, let me take this just straightforward example. So this is, they're putting together this TV stand. This is the way it looked a lot. So they were, no delays, no overlap, anything. They did a lot of that. But there are parts in which there are these long silences. And if you're a traditional person in dialogue, you think, no, turn-taking is supposed to be immediate. And there's a whole long tradition of saying that should come immediately after this should come immediately after that. But that isn't what these guys did. There are these 6 seconds, 23 seconds, 6 seconds between turns. Why? Well, it should be obvious. They're doing something in those 6 seconds. So take the 6 seconds up there. They're sitting there placing this board. They're doing a lot of the basic joint activity there. That is, they're building this TV stand, and that's taken up by that 6 seconds. And down here, they're twisting the screws in. When they have a screwdriver and they're doing this and doing all this kind of stuff. Okay, all of this is to say, why you're doing this? Well, I am not going to go to the next step until I'm ready. That is, it isn't needed until we're done doing what we're supposed to be doing so far. This is the actual stuff that happened in that putting together. They were doing silent stuff most of the time. And the tradition in conversation analysis is to think conversations consist of people talking all the time. They do not. They only do that if, in fact, what you've got is a joint activity in which you're doing everything by language. Okay, I'm going to give you several examples with, for people who haven't seen this again.
Over the red.
So this woman here is telling him how to put this together, and she's got a little model like that, and she's telling him how to do this. Now, what I want you to listen to, or I'll show you, is she says, now take a medium green and a medium red. And then there's this long 3 seconds of silence. But he is he's retrieving this green and red block even before she finishes this sentence. He starts immediately, as soon as he can possibly do this, he starts doing it. And she then waits for him to get it all out there and get it ready. And only then does she go on to the next sentence. That is, this is really, when needed, do not speak until it's possible, until the other person is ready. So this is, Tom initiates retrieving the blocks as soon as he's ready, but she doesn't initiate her next utterance until he is ready. And this is just standard. Another example, he's having trouble putting this thing together, taking a long time. Oh, it's a long time. And he's watching this. So he then, he says, Alan, so Alan says, right, and here's this other guy taking 8 seconds to put this thing together. And finally, at the end, Ben shows that he's ready, and Alan says, okay. And then he goes on to the next instruction. You do not go on until you're ready, till everyone's ready. So cross-timing has that property. So there are two things I hope you saw here. One of them is I'm perfectly happy to overlap things. I start looking for this block even before you have finished telling me what block to get. So I initiate a signal to make a commitment, and I initiate a basic action to fulfill a commitment. I initiate it as soon as it is needed for the next stage, or it is possible, and it is possible under current conditions. And so the cross-timing is immediate when it is spoken because of this condition here, but it's overlapping in all other cases. I mean, if there's no interference, you just go ahead and do it. I have to decide how much more to bore you with, not to bore you with, to go into this timing and spoken interaction. So we were looking here at cases where they were building something, but in spoken interactions, there's a notion of timeliness just in general. So let me do this fairly quickly. When you're speaking, there's a notion that you should be just as fast at responding as you can. That's the when needed principle here. And so let's look at spoken turns. So spoken turns should look like this. This is the traditional theory of conversation turn taking. You do them immediately, and there's a lot of evidence for it. You should get superposed things like but you shouldn't get these things down here except for gestures which do not interrupt. So you get overlapping gestures, but you never get overlapping speech turns. So here is an example of a timely answer. So is Peter home? Yes. Now, the timing of that yes was supposed to tell you I'm doing this at the appropriate time for the answer to that question. And you implicate that the yes is the answer to the question by doing it right there. If I did it 5 minutes later, you'd never know that yes was the answer to that question. So there's a projected moment, typically. And here is, this is an old experiment that Vicki Smith and I did. In what sport is the Stanley Cup awarded? Now, even North Americans don't know this very well. Hockey. And if that's said right then and there, it's the appropriate thing to do. But we found people who didn't know the answer, and it took them that's 6 seconds to come up with the right answer. What did they do? And I talked about this the other day. They tell you that they are delayed, and like they say, And so the problem here is that he has yet to formulate the answer, and so he has to explain why isn't it that he's not doing this in a timely manner. We get this Stanley Cup, soccer, I don't know. So you get these things here where they're saying these sorts of things. They have, as a part of their grounding, they have these ways of telling you, I am not yet ready to do the next step here, and this is the way they do it. They have various means. Okay, now, and here's a means that they have of telling you that they are understanding as they go along. I talked about this the other day, this yes. But that's telling you that I understand up to the word yes. So the timing of the word yes is telling you something about what it is that I actually understand. It is the stuff that just came before the word yes. And the stuff that just came before the word is something I don't understand. So that was the other part that we gave the other day. Now, this is the general evidence of spoken conversations. This is where there's overlap of the current speaker with the prior speaker. Here's the overlap of the current speaker with, there's a gap here. So you should really get 0 milliseconds between turns, and by God, people are terrific at this. So if they're so good at this, why don't they always do it? Well, because they want to use the timing to do things. And so mistiming, this is an accidental mistiming. So here's, I mean, this whole system being invited somewhere for lunch and for dinner and overnight and breakfast, and this other guy, Cal, thinks that she's done with overnight. So he starts in here. Well, he gets started. He realizes, no, she's still talking. So he stops. He breaks this off and said, you did stay. So the offset of this thing here, that is the place where it's broken, is to tell her he's abandoning this, his turn right there. That's a signal that he's doing it because he doesn't have to, as this example doesn't show you yet. Here, and I'm trying to remember where I gave this example the other day too here, but here is a director with a prototype, and here's... I did show this the other day, and here's what's happening. Of course, she is saying, I put it on the right-hand half of, then she will say, whatever the block is down here. He is picking up his block and poising it right here. She has to break off. She cannot continue. If she doesn't continue, he thinks I've got it in the wrong place, and so he then puts the block in some other place. So she has to stop and say yes. It's obligatory for her to do this. And so the cutting off, as she does, and saying yes right there is to signal that that is the correct thing for him to be doing. And the timing of this is then crucial, as it says here. So this is just what I had given you the other day. This is the crucial thing. That is, the yes is the moment for response to Ken's poise. That is, she's saying, this is yes to that poise. And it's timed so that it goes right there, and you can see it. And her offset is also saying, I'm changing my plan in mid-utterance, and I'm stopping here, which she then goes on to say this yes. I won't go into this. Here is where you deliberately overlap to do things. And the first one here is so if I'm overlapping with something that Peter is saying, I'm basically not listening to him anymore. And so I'm telling him also that I'm not listening anymore by timing it in that way. The timing is crucial as a signal, as I am using that pragmatically. So this is pragmatic timing. So here's Maggie saying, there doesn't really seem anything. And her husband, this brutal guy, says, but how long do you think it'll take them to finish? And he starts overlapping here. Well, she could have gone on. She actually stopped and let him interrupt her. But he is interrupting her quite deliberately. And this is being done by the way he times the beginning of his turn. And the way you see this, so that's what I'm saying here. The way you see this is to look at Maggie Thatcher. Here she was being interviewed by a guy named Toohey, Dennis Toohey. And she says, there are comparatively few people, they could be measured in thousands, who wish to destroy the kind of society which you and I value, destroy the free society. And Tui starts to ask his next question. You were talking about striking ambulance workers. You were talking about ancillary workers in hospitals. Actually, this is a repeat, a recycle of this sentence here. This is another version of it. She doesn't stop. She's got this overlap. Please, please, this is the most, please, this is the most, please, this is the most important point you have raised. She doesn't let him do it. That is, the thing that Maggie allowed, which was to allow Ken to interrupt her, this Maggie Thatcher didn't allow, and you can hear in one interview after another, she does this all over the place. She's really wild, was wild. And that doesn't mean anything. So here's, this is called a recycle, turn beginning. So here's a guy who's finishing a turn, but Ben wants to say, I've got the next turn. And so he starts, yeah, and I didn't know. And once this turn is over, he starts his whole turn over again to show that this part, I'm telling you that I'm going to take the next turn. I can predict what you're going to say. And then, but he realizes that it can't be heard unless he repeats it. So all of this is that way. And this will be my final example, even though I've got other sorts of things. Timing is something I didn't talk about when I was talking about grounding the other day. It's a huge part of the whole business of grounding. So here's caller calls into I don't know, some kind of official network. This is an example of Gail Jefferson's. And downtown, though, she worked for, I don't know if you know, Russ Oglethorpe. Now, this is, the caller is telling this guy here, desk, something. He interrupts her in the middle of the word Oglethorpe to say, yeah. Now, why does he do this? He doesn't wait. What he does is to show. He doesn't even need to listen to the final part of the word Oglethorpe to be able to say, yes, I know him. And actually, she's given enough evidence ahead of time that he actually has a good guess. And by the time he said Russ and Ogle, then she will know this. So this onset of yeah is saying, I recognize this guy already. You don't need to go on. OK, what I'm going to do here is to quickly end. So how to indicate? I've talked about these spatial indexes and temporal indexes and the various ways that they have of doing this. The crucial point, though, if you don't get anything else from this lecture, is we can't communicate in the least. We can't make things common by themselves. We have to make them common against what we already take to be common, namely our common ground. And the only way we can do that is to do it individually. I have to do my common ground with Peter's, not my common ground with Marianne's. It's just, I can't use her and my common ground in place of his. So we have to, in every utterance, make sure that we have specified who the speaker and the addressee is, even to know what language we should be using. I mean, if I'm talking to Peter, I have to use English. If I were talking to somebody else, I might have to be using Dutch, let's say. And it anchors all this other stuff. So you can't do this without anchoring. The thanks is also something that you're all supposed to be able to see and recognize as common ground. Thanks.
Have some time for questions?
I must have infuriated somebody here. Yeah.
I'm just curious about something. When it comes to pointing, it strikes me that sometimes when we are pointing, we're doing something a bit different than indexing. You know? We are doing something that could be characterized as a sort of prescriptive act or telling someone to make something the case. No? I think actually some of the photos you showed were suitable as examples of prescriptive acts. Would you say that?
Oh, absolutely. So the things that I gave you on that one page where I said this character, no, this book, this man, and so on, that was a case where I was looking at reference. But if you just take pointing in general, it can be used to make commands. It can be used to point out things that are of interest. And these are always contextually defined in some way, but they always depend on me locating an indicatum of some sort.
And why do you think that?
Sorry?
So why do you think that?
Because there's no other way to index all these other things that I would need to index. So the way I get to Shakespeare is through that physical book. If that physical book weren't there, I couldn't do Shakespeare. And it's through that set of indexes that you get there that way. And I mean, I haven't thought about all these cases, but I can say out. And I just can't say out. Well, I probably could, but where I'm sort of saying outside. I mean, I want you outside, but I could be saying out, indicating the door that you're supposed to go out. I mean, all of these are empirically interesting questions, how you get the indexes right. As I said, getting the indexes, the chain of indexes right, and getting the interpretation of what it is that you know, that I'm supposed to be ultimately indexing is the crucial. Well, it's hard, and I don't know how to do it. I mean, I don't have any big theory about that, put it that way.
Okay, thanks.
Well, you have some problems with your indexing as a temporal, your indexing time. I mean, my example is Obama waving to Bush. And you translated that I hereby now say goodbye to you. But this now, I mean, you can't do it in other point of time, so there is no option. I mean, it's not indexing now because you can't. You're doing it now, but you're not indexing the time because you couldn't wave to him yesterday while you were there. I mean, so I don't see that this is.
No, that's the whole point, actually.
Yeah, but then it's not
I
an
can
index,
wave,
then.
but it wouldn't be saying I'm bidding you goodbye now. That's the real point here. That is, I'm getting the content of the goodbye. It's goodbye to you at this moment, now. That's the now. What the now is, I mean, that's what the moment of the, so, I mean, let's take a really simple case. So, there are two people leaving on the train, and I wave to one and I wave to the other separately. Now, I can't have done it 5 seconds before, and I can't have done it to the second person who has not gone, and the first person has gone. I mean, the timing of those things have to be exactly right. Now, what it means is I could have waved at any time. It's just that I wouldn't be waving goodbye at the right moment. And to get the moment right, I have to do the waving. I mean, what you're saying, of course, is in some ways it makes it trivial. Makes it sound trivial, but it isn't trivial. I mean, to trivialize it is to lose its real essence. I mean, because the now is crucial in all these cases. If I do it 2 seconds too early, it's going to seem. Suppose Obama was, as Bush was going up the stairways, was going like this the whole time, he would be seen as trying to get rid of Bush, as opposed to being polite and saying goodbye to Bush at the right moment. So it has to be done at the right moment to get the right interpretation of goodbye. Because it could be good riddance, which it should have been. Okay. And I mean, to really take the timing of the interruptions and these other things, those timings are really, I mean, it's the precise timing of the yeah for Oglethorpe, for example, and for these other interruptions, and for a bunch of things that I didn't show you. Those timings are really an essential part of your interpretation of what I, the speaker, am doing, what I am doing. And everyone recognizes this. No one seems to worry about it, but it's an essential part of what you're doing. Simple point.
Ingvar Johansson.
Now, I hope I didn't offend you with another one of
No.
another philosopher that
No.
So you're going to tell me that you love Stephen.
Searle can take it. I will not say anything about Searle.
Stephen Schiffer. Do you love Stephen Schiffer?
No.
Oh, well, there. So we're in agreement here.
But I will comment on him. But I don't love Searle either. But I think his taxonomy for very good reason, be put in your theory.
And indeed,
that's my simple point
I agree with that. So
okay, good then.
That's done and gone with. So.
But first, once again, I would like to thank for a very nice, interesting, and convincing talk. Really nice. This now, I will bring in 2 metaphysical issues, if that's okay.
Oh gosh.
Nah, gosh, yeah, but it's because of my interest, and
I know.
I've listened 3 times, will listen a 4th time, so give me some minutes. When you started today, you talked about common ground, and in one of the first slides, if you can put it on, you spoke about you and Peter, and you had as a common ground, communication created a common ground, perceiving the same objects.
Perceptual.
Perceptual, yeah. Okay, but now comes my point. You had communication first and common perceptual experience as second. And from your point of view, it doesn't matter, I guess, if you had switched it so you have started with common perceptual experience. But to my interest in metaphysics, to my surprise, a number of philosophers in the 20th century have obviously and quite explicitly had the view that first comes language and then comes community, whereas my opinion is first comes common perception, then rises language. Yeah.
I can go to Turkey and have a perfectly good communication with Turks. I don't know a word of Turkish. And in fact, my wife and I have done this. You know, you go to Turkey, and I started to take notes on what we managed to communicate all over the place that we did without a single piece of language.
Yeah.
So,
but good. Then, just want
and
to ask about your opinion, and I'm very pleased to hear your answer. Then Schiffer, can you bring on? It is slide 21 or 22, I guess. We can take it, but perhaps other people are in order to see it. Can you put on slide 21 or 22?
Let's see if I can find it. I should be able to find it.
Well, I can...
No, I'll find it. Here.
Yeah, that one.
I can back up so it doesn't have this on it.
Yeah, okay. I can't resist making this comment because I wrote some pages about it several decades ago. And
oh my God, this is always a problem.
My simple point is that you make them really opposed, and as they are presented, they are opposed. But there is a way of combining them, and that is to take a view that Aristotle uses when he discusses length, distance. There are finite distances. Nothing in the world consists of actually infinitely many parts. But he says every distance contains infinitely many potential parts. And then I made once the comment that you can take Schiffer and say what he writes down should only be regarded as, so to speak, a potential infinity, not a real infinity, and then you can get a synthesis out of these 2 views.
So I'm going to deeply disagree with that, and I'm going to do it in several ways. And can I do it on the spot here?
Okay.
One of the ways is that what I say here, it's this thing right here, and that if you take so notice what I didn't say is, in some sense, of course, you can make these 2 things equivalent. But it turns out that here's the first thing that happens when you have 2 people. This side, these things grow linearly.
But if they are potential parts...
No, they grow exponentially.
They grow exponentially. But if they are potential parts, they are not real
well, now,
parts.
all right. So, but then you would have to be in the position that if I'm talking to the 3 people here, I am somehow doing something different from when I'm just talking to Peter alone. That is, and that I can go 3 or 4 deep when thinking about Peter, but I can only go 1 deep thinking about the three of them because it's so much more complex over here. And I think you do not want to take that. I don't think there's any evidence, psychological or any other kind, for that position.
We have different concepts of being a potential part, but forget it. I just wanted to hear your response,
yeah.
And it's completely beside the main thread of your talk, so forget it.
I'll give you just one other reference, and this is to, and I know this might be impossible in this group, to a pair of Danes. This is Peter Harder and a guy named Christian Koch. And they have a theory of presupposition failure in which they show it makes a difference as to whether you go 1 deep, 2 deep, 3 deep, or 4 deep. Various kinds of things happen when you go the 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 deep. They're different representations is their point. And it isn't just that these are potential. They're actually, in some cases, they're treated really. That is, to lie, I have to know one deep down. And that's easy to show in this one. It is impossible to show in this one. And there are a bunch of other properties that make me think that that's not the right way to go, at least psychologically. Yeah. I had this conversation, by the way, with Bob Stolnicker years ago. He would say, well, you know, does it really make a difference? And so I said, we had this, I mean, it was a long, pretty serious discussion. He says, well, for philosophers, in some ways, I think he would take your position, namely, the potential is really all you're interested in, and this is a representation. It's just a representation. And then he would agree with me, though at the same time, he would say, but it can't be psychologically or what one has in one's head because it's infinite. And it has the potential to go 3, 4, 5, and depending on how far down you go, you get different, you draw different conclusions. But it's a big, there's a longer argument here, so. That lady there is champing at the bit.
I actually have questions about the anchoring in time, but I feel compelled to ask you about anchoring in space.
Okay.
I find the various spatial indexing devices interesting. So I want to push you on what you mean by pointing.
I didn't mean a thing by pointing. I used the word spatial index, and I then said, I mean, so for the ordinary person, pointing is the kind of the prototype of this stuff. But when I am presenting a facet and indicating something by means of this facet and this zone out here, that's not pointing in any traditional sense. And it took our friend, our mutual friend Mondana, to point out to me that German doesn't even have a word even remotely like the word point in English. So, I mean, you can't even discuss it in this sense in German. Now, this I didn't really know, but then there's a whole lot of stuff I don't really know. But, so I agree, and the word pointing was simply a kind of fake way into this. So the other thing, I mean, holding something out, exhibiting it, is not pointing, but it's certainly indicating, and is a kind of index that doesn't look like what I call the self-index. Certainly doesn't look like other things.
But so this is, I mean, this was exactly my point, because I liked the much wider range of resources that you now listed as forms of indicating the facet, the self-indexing, the exhibited. Was that the right word?
Yeah, exhibited.
Exhibited index.
Not a good term, but then I want you to give me a better term. You're always coming up with better terms.
No, that's fine. But I was annoyed by the pointing because.
Annoyed.
No, but because I think that this is what people think of. I mean, you said that, right? The typical example, or you use the term prototypical. Typical, and it's pointing. And it's problematic in all sorts of ways. What is prototypical pointing anyway? But so you're using indexing as a superordinate term that actually subsumes all these other kinds of indexing. I like that. That makes things a lot clearer, I think.
And I want you to remember that this is just an elaboration of Peirce. He didn't discuss things like facet indexing or self-indexing, but he had lots of examples with lots of these sorts of things in them.
Yes, considering that you speak highly of Lewis, and also considering you said that he tried to see common ground as shared between not only two agents but several agents.
Communities, he called them.
Communities.
Populations.
Why do you stick to two agents mostly?
Because I'm trying to apply this to conversational interaction, which is in the, do I dare use the word prototypical case, two people. And so that's a nice place to start. Actually, if you remember, Lewis actually had various ways of thinking about populations, because you can't assume. I mean, so his examples have a kind of character of the kind I would think about as communal common ground, in the sense that you look at all Americans and you take for granted they're all going to know how many senators there are in the Senate. Now, how many people in this room know how many senators there are in the American Senate? So, well, there are two of you and you're both Americans. See, that's it. That's it. So let's get a random guess from a Swede around here. Who's going to give me a random guess? No, I won't do this. But we take it for granted, that kind of thing. And he then had a little index about what's the likelihood. I mean, he was basically doing some kind of Bayesian probabilities on this. What's the prior likelihood that if I meet another American, they're going to know how many people there are in the Senate? And so he had that as a kind of index on his, in his model there. And in some ways, I've reduced it to a rather more primitive version where, I mean, it's certainly fully consistent with everything he says, but dealing with just two people. But when I meet another single person, I'm still making these kinds of estimates. So there's no reason other than I'm interested in conversation. Conversations are not held with populations.
So it's not a kind of application, more or less, than Lewis is?
Well, you can denigrate it any way you like, but I think it's a perfectly good thing to do. Here's a short, I have to say this because it was one of the proudest moments in my, my life. So I convinced my son, who was at Princeton, to take a course from David Lewis, and he took David Lewis's very last seminar. David Lewis died over the summer after that seminar. My son is a physicist, and so why would he take a course from David Lewis? Because Lewis talks about time travel and physical things of this sort that are really interesting to physicists. But happily, he did all this stuff that was related to language. So, but I was extremely happy that he was able to do this. That I've never taken a course from Lewis, so it was great that I have a son who would do this. By the way, he would object to my having told that story. He would say, "Dad, you should not have done that." And so don't ever tell him that I told you this story here.
Okay, I don't think anyone wants to ask more
They're timed out. I think the alarm went off.
Okay. Thank you.
So thank you.
Again.